For as long as action movies have existed, audiences have been drawn to villains who radiate danger figures of pure menace, defined by sharp edges and ruthless intent. But what many viewers never realized is that some of these antagonists were never originally written as simple embodiments of evil. Before the cameras rolled, before the final edits were locked, many of these villains carried emotional depth, wounded histories, and tragedies that shaped every terrible act they would eventually commit. Yet none of that ever reached the screen. Studios have always held tight control over how villains are portrayed. Executives worried that if audiences understood the pain behind the violence, the clean division between good and evil might blur. In some cases, early test screenings revealed that viewers felt too much sympathy for the antagonist, shifting the emotional balance of the story. And in a genre built on speed, clarity, and adrenaline, nuance was often seen as an inconvenience. So entire pasts were erased. Flashbacks showing why a villain fell into darkness. Dialogues that exposed vulnerability. Scenes that revealed a broken childhood, a betrayal, or a defining loss. Draft pages with motivations far more human than the final cut dared to show. All were cut away, leaving only fragments of the character's original identity. And so, the villains we saw were only half-drawn shadows of the creations they once were. Today, we're pulling back that curtain. In this episode, we look at 15 action films where the villain's backstory was removed before release, hidden drafts, abandoned character arcs, deleted scenes, and emotional layers buried deep by studio decisions. These forgotten origins reveal a completely different side to antagonists we thought we already understood. It's time to uncover the stories that were never meant to see the light. Fact 1. Out for Justice. In Out for Justice, Richie Madano explodes onto the screen as a reckless, drug-fueled maniac driven by impulse and chaos. But earlier versions of the script told a very different story, one that reshaped Richie from an unhinged killer into a deeply damaged product of his environment. Originally, Richie's character was built around a lifetime of emotional wounds. His connection to Gino wasn't casual. He grew up idolizing him, seeing in Gino the strength and respect he never found at home. Several removed scenes traced Richie's troubled youth, revealing the violent household that shaped him, a father prone to rage, a mother who endured it, and a boy who learned early that pain was the only constant he could rely on. One deleted flashback illustrated Richie trying and failing to escape the criminal world. He attempted to clean himself up, even sought help, but the shadows of his upbringing dragged him back. Addiction didn't define him. It consumed him. His descent wasn't meant to look random. It was the collapse of a man who never had a chance to stand on stable ground. However, test screenings produced unexpected reactions. Viewers sympathized with Richie more than the studio anticipated. Executives feared that giving Richie emotional depth would weaken the hero's presence, so they stripped away the backstory, leaving only a caricature of madness. What remained in the final film was a villain without context. But beneath the surface was a broken man drowning in a lifetime of hurt. Fact 2. I Come in Peace. In the theatrical version of I Come in Peace, Tallac is framed as a relentless extraterrestrial predator, cold, mechanical, and entirely devoid of emotion. But the earliest drafts of the script revealed a much richer, more tragic foundation for the character. Originally, Tallac was imagined as a refugee of a dying world. His species, once thriving, had been devastated by a violent conflict that tore multiple star systems apart. His mission to harvest endorphins on Earth wasn't an act of sadistic pleasure. It was desperation. One deleted sequence involved a holographic display of his ravaged homeworld, establishing Tallac as a survivor, attempting to secure a biochemical resource vital for his race's survival. Another scrapped storyline suggested a history between Tallac and Azek, the alien law enforcer on his trail. They weren't strangers. They were former warriors from the same crumbling civilization, forcibly separated by the war that fractured their people. Their conflict was never meant to be just predator versus pursuer. It was meant to be a tragedy of brothers turned enemies by circumstance. Yet these elements were dismissed during production. Studio executives believed a sympathetic alien would undercut the film's impact as a fast-paced sci-fi thriller. Instead, they wanted a creature whose menace was immediate and uncompromising. So Tallac's history vanished in the edit, transforming a desperate survivor into a monster stripped of motive and meaning. Fact 3. Bulletproof. In Bulletproof, Colonel Cardiff is portrayed as a ruthless warlord whose lust for weapons and profit drives his every decision. But the original script envisioned him as something far more tragic, a patriot abandoned by the very government he once served. Early drafts revealed Cardiff as the leader of a covert operations team tasked with a near-impossible mission. Betrayed from within, he and his men were left stranded in hostile territory. A powerful deleted flashback showed Cardiff holding the dog tags of fallen teammates, realizing they had been sacrificed to cover up political mistakes. This moment was designed to be the emotional core of his transformation. Another removed scene portrayed Cardiff grappling with survivor's guilt, replaying the mission's final moments and questioning every choice he made. His turn toward the arms trade wasn't about greed. It was a refusal to trust any system again. He sought power because he believed it was the only shield against betrayal. But the studio rejected this layered portrayal. Executives feared that audiences would find Cardiff too sympathetic, blurring the line between hero and villain. They pushed for a simpler interpretation, a violent man hungry for money and chaos. So his emotional layers were cut, his trauma erased. What remained was a shell, a villain redefined not by pain, but by simplicity. Fact 4. The Perfect Weapon. In The Perfect Weapon, Yoshida stands as a precise, imposing Yakuza figure whose presence radiates controlled violence. Yet early drafts reveal that he wasn't originally conceived as a purely cold antagonist. Instead, Yoshida was meant to be a man shaped by years of cultural isolation, carrying a past filled with conflicted identity and quiet suffering. Initial scripts introduced Yoshida as someone born between two worlds, constantly rejected for being not enough of either. This sense of displacement haunted him from childhood. One omitted sequence depicted young Yoshida being mocked by both American and Japanese peers, a moment highlighting the emotional fractures that would eventually define his adult resolve. These experiences weren't simply painful, they became the foundation for his relentless pursuit of belonging. Another deleted scene showed Yoshida performing a small, private ritual for his mother, hinting at an inner vulnerability the final film never explores. In the original vision, he wasn't driven by ambition alone. He wanted a place to belong, to build an identity no one could take from him. This is what made the Yakuza so seductive. It offered structure where his life once had none. There was also a planned confrontation between Yoshida and the protagonist in which Yoshida draws parallels between their paths, two outsiders who shaped their strength from rejection. But the studio cut this exchange, fearing it made Yoshida too sympathetic and complicated the clean hero-villain dichotomy. What audiences ultimately saw was a refined, lethal enforcer. What they were never shown was a man fighting ghosts of a childhood where he was never allowed to fit in. Fact 5. The Peacekeeper. In The Peacekeeper, Dragon Svoboda is depicted as a formidable extremist, with little more than ambition and ruthlessness guiding him. But early versions of his character reveal a deeply tormented figure forged in the chaos of war and shaped by betrayal long before he ever became the villain audiences recognize. Originally, Dragon was written as a soldier who lived through the devastation of the Balkan conflict. One removed sequence portrayed him wandering through what remained of his village, carrying the body of a fallen loved one. This silent, harrowing moment was intended to peel back the layers of his hardened demeanor and expose the devastation that reshaped him. Another scrapped subplot explored Dragon's toxic relationship with a superior officer who abandoned him during a failed mission. This betrayal destroyed any remaining trust he had in leadership, convincing him that the systems he once served were corrupt beyond redemption. His spiral into extremism wasn't rooted in greed, it was born from disillusionment and heartbreak. A planned emotional confrontation would have shown Dragon confessing that all he ever wanted was stability after losing everything. But studio executives felt this softened his persona too much, undermining the straightforward action tone they wanted to maintain. Thus, every thread of humanity was erased from his final portrayal. Dragon became an archetypal villain, but behind that mask was a soul shaped by war's cruelty and a world that had pushed him past his breaking point. Fact say, Black Eagle. In Black Eagle, Andre, played by a young Jean-Claude Van Damme, moves like a silent predator, defined by icy discipline and unspoken brutality. But early drafts of the film gave Andre an emotional dimension that was ultimately stripped away to present him strictly as a physical threat. Originally, Andre's story began with him being taken from his family as a child and placed in a secretive Soviet training facility. A removed flashback showed young Andre sitting alone in a cold dormitory, clutching a small keepsake from home, an image designed to remind viewers that he wasn't born a killer. He was sculpted into one. Another abandoned storyline featured Andre questioning the morality of his missions after witnessing the corruption within the KGB. In one version of the script, he even hesitates during a hostage situation, subtly revealing the conflict between his conditioning and a sense of conscience trying to break through. However, because Van Damme's rising popularity was tied to physicality rather than emotional performance, the studio cut nearly all of these introspective elements. They wanted a stoic, intimidating opponent for Sho Kosugi, not a villain whose past evoked sympathy. What remained on screen was a streamlined, almost mechanical antagonist. But beneath the edits was a tragic figure. A man shaped by indoctrination, yearning for humanity that the system beat out of him long before the story began. Fact 7. Rapid Fire. In Rapid Fire, Kinman Tao is introduced as a polished, calculating crime lord whose empire thrives on order, discipline, and silent intimidation. But the earliest interpretations of his character painted him not as a sleek villain, but as a tormented figure shaped by a traumatic childhood steeped in political violence. Initial script drafts placed Tao as the son of a dissident who attempted to expose corruption in Hong Kong's entrenched power structures. As a young boy, Tao was forced to watch his father's execution, an event that would fracture his world and create a lifelong obsession with power as a means of protection. One removed scene depicted Tao quietly lighting incense in memory of his father, suggesting a layer of grief beneath his controlled exterior. Another sequence that never made it past pre-production involved Tao explaining his philosophy, that only absolute power can shield a man from betrayal. His hunger for control wasn't rooted in ego, but in the fear of falling victim to the same forces that destroyed his family. Producers ultimately decided these elements made Tao too emotionally complex. They feared audiences would empathize with him, possibly overshadowing Brandon Lee's protagonist. As a result, every trace of Tao's emotional origins was cut, leaving only the cold, elegant kingpin seen in the theatrical release. The Tao we saw was a villain built from precision. The Tao originally intended was a wounded son hardened by loss. Fact 8. Showdown in Little Tokyo. In Showdown in Little Tokyo, Yoshida takes center stage as a stylish yet savage Yakuza boss, whose presence dominates every scene. But the earliest concepts for his character reveal a very different figure, one shaped by shame, loss, and an unrelenting desire to reclaim the honor stripped from his family. Early drafts described Yoshida as a boy who experienced the violent death of his father, a low-ranking Yakuza soldier who was executed without dignity. The trauma of that moment defined Yoshida's view of the world. A deleted montage showed his journey through underground training circles, driven not by sadism, but by an urgent need to rebuild the legacy his father lost. Another removed moment featured Yoshida and Kenner sharing a tense conversation acknowledging their parallel histories. Their rivalry wasn't meant to be simple hero versus villain. It was a clash between two men shaped by trauma in different ways. However, the studio prioritized a more flamboyant antagonist, someone whose exaggerated presence matched the film's tone. The nuanced human elements were cut, leaving behind a villain defined by theatrical brutality rather than emotional scars. The Yoshida we got is larger than life. The Yoshida we never saw was a son chasing the shadow of a fallen father. Fact 9. Deadly Outbreak. In Deadly Outbreak, Baron storms through the film as a violent extremist, driven by chaos and apparent madness. But the original blueprints for his character envisioned him as a former soldier broken by betrayal, shaped by loyalty that was never returned. Initial drafts positioned Baron as a decorated operative who led a covert mission overseas. When his superiors unexpectedly pulled support, his squad was slaughtered, and Baron barely escaped with his life. One removed flashback showed him dragging a fallen comrade through the rubble as he listened to radio chatter confirming they had been abandoned for political convenience. Another deleted scene revealed a softer wound, a letter from the daughter he once tried to reconnect with, reminding him of a life he couldn't salvage. This was intended to highlight the emotional turmoil driving his radicalization. Studio executives, however, feared this version of Baron would complicate the film's straightforward siege narrative. They insisted on keeping him feral, unpredictable, and devoid of emotional grounding. Thus, the film's final version offers only a manic antagonist, while the script's original vision revealed a man shattered by betrayal and grief. Fact 10. The Hunted. In The Hunted, Kinjo moves like a spectral force, silent, ritualistic, and seemingly carved from centuries of tradition. But the earliest portrayals of his character painted him not as an emotionless assassin, but as a deeply scarred soul molded by tragedy and forced indoctrination. Original drafts revealed that Kinjo was taken from his home as a child after witnessing the brutal murder of his parents during a political purge. A discarded flashback showed him being dragged into the shadows by members of the Mikado clan, his tears mixing with rain as he realized he had no family left. This abduction marked the beginning of his transformation from terrified boy to conditioned killer. Another removed scene depicted Kinjo performing a cleansing ritual alone after a mission not out of honor, but as a desperate attempt to wash away the guilt he could never escape. The silence associated with him in the final cut was never meant to signify discipline. It was emotional suppression, a survival instinct he learned early to avoid punishment. A planned conversation between Kinjo and Paul further explored their parallels. Two men shaped by violence, but forced down wildly different paths. Kinjo's loyalty to the clan wasn't devotion, it was fear wrapped in ritual. But this dynamic was trimmed away because producers felt it softened the film's tension. Without these elements, Kinjo appears as a stoic, unstoppable force. But beneath the edits lay a story of a child stolen, a man broken, and a life forged in captivity rather than choice. Fact 11. Excessive Force. In the cut of Excessive Force that reached audiences, Franco is portrayed as an explosive, unpredictable gang leader with a taste for violence and theatrical brutality. But the initial blueprint for his character offered a dramatically different interpretation, one rooted in betrayal and a desperate attempt to survive the consequences of trusting the wrong people. Original drafts revealed Franco as a former informant who risked everything to help law enforcement dismantle a dangerous mob family. Yet after fulfilling his end of the deal, he was abandoned without protection. A removed flashback showed Franco hiding in a cheap motel room, bleeding from an ambush he narrowly escaped, listening to police chatter that confirmed he had been left out to dry. This betrayal fractured what little faith he had in the system. Another deleted thread explored Franco's turbulent relationship with his younger brother, who had been manipulated by corrupt officers into criminal work. Franco's shift into a life of violence wasn't meant to be a pursuit of dominance. It was an attempt to shield his brother from the same fate he suffered. But producers worried this layered depiction would muddy the moral line between hero and villain, turning Franco into a character audiences might sympathize with. To maintain a sharper contrast with the protagonist, every emotional layer was removed. Thus, the final Franco became a loud, volatile villain devoid of personal history. But the original version was a man betrayed, cornered, and driven into darkness by the very people he once served. Fact 12. Rage. In Rage, the antagonist Matsson is presented as a cold, calculating government operative pulling strings from behind the scenes. But the earliest incarnations of his character show a drastically different picture, one centered around heartbreak, moral conflict, and a descent shaped by unbearable personal tragedy. Originally, Matsson was portrayed as a brilliant behavioral scientist whose research focused on helping trauma victims rebuild their lives. But everything changed when a catastrophic lab explosion tied to a government experiment he had opposed claimed the lives of his wife and child. A powerful deleted scene depicted Matsson sitting alone in the wreckage of his lab, clutching his daughter's burnt toy, realizing that the system he trusted had destroyed his world. Another removed sequence showed Matsson trying to sabotage the very program he was forced to work for, only to be threatened with imprisonment. The emotional heart of the character was his conflict between conscience and coercion. He wasn't evil for entertainment, he was coerced into becoming the architect of destruction. A planned monologue, which never made it to set, had Matsson confess that he once believed in healing, but grief turned that mission into a twisted obsession with control. The studio, however, felt this portrayal made him too sympathetic, reducing the pure villain energy required for a fast-paced action film. In the end, the theatrical Matsson became a cold, bureaucratic villain. But the unseen version was a man crushed by loss, remade into something unrecognizable by the same system that destroyed everything he loved. Fact 13. The Presidio. In The Presidio, Colonel Lawrence is presented as a corrupt officer whose criminal activities appear to be the result of selfish ambition. But the earliest versions of the story revealed a far more emotionally charged motivation, one grounded in guilt, betrayal, and the collapse of his moral compass. Originally, Lawrence was depicted as a loyal soldier who led a classified mission overseas. The operation, however, quickly descended into a tragic disaster when a miscommunication resulted in civilian casualties. A removed flashback showed Lawrence standing among the ruins, overwhelmed by the chaos he inadvertently helped create. Instead of receiving support from his superiors, he was quietly blamed for the incident, reshaped into the scapegoat for a politically damaging failure. Another abandoned subplot followed Lawrence attempting to expose the corruption embedded within the upper ranks. Instead of being heard, he was threatened, reassigned, and left with nothing but resentment. This betrayal by the institution he had dedicated his life to became the spark that pushed him into the black market network we see in the finished film. A scripted but never shot conversation between Lawrence and his former commanding officer revealed his internal conflict. He didn't want to break the law, but he no longer trusted a system that punished honesty. Producers cut the scene, fearing it would shift too much sympathy toward him and disrupt the clean hero versus villain dynamic. In the theatrical cut, Lawrence is a straightforward antagonist, but buried in the early drafts was a tragic figure. A man attempting to reclaim control in a world that abandoned him. Fact 14. Silent Trigger. In Silent Trigger, the director is portrayed as a distant overseer, an enigmatic figure issuing orders from behind a veil of monitors and shadows. But early drafts gave him a deeply personal origin, one rooted in trauma, regret, and a past overflowing with pain. Originally, the director was a former field operative who once led a highly trained team. During a disastrous mission, faulty intelligence sent from higher-ups seeking to bury their own mistakes led to the deaths of every member under his command. A removed scene showed him discovering the bodies of his squad mates, the weight of responsibility crushing him in a single moment. This tragedy drove him away from field work. Retreating into the shadows, he adopted a new philosophy. Absolute control prevents loss. His obsession with precision and detachment wasn't ambition, it was grief transformed into cold methodology. In one unfilmed monologue, he admitted that emotions had cost him everything, calling them the enemy of survival. Another deleted sequence revealed how his worldview mirrored that of the protagonist, turning their conflict into a psychological duel rather than a simple showdown. Producers cut these moments, fearing the film would shift from action thriller into somber character study. The final version presents him as a faceless villain. But beneath that mask was a shattered leader clinging desperately to control after losing everything. Fact 15. Mission of Justice. In Mission of Justice, Dr. Rachel Larkin is shown as a domineering, authoritarian leader who uses her organization to enforce a twisted idea of purity. But her original backstory revealed a much more tragic figure, a woman molded by grief, disillusionment, and the collapse of her identity. Early drafts described Larkin as once being a gifted trauma surgeon who dedicated her life to saving others. Her world unraveled during a chaotic medical emergency where a young patient died in her arms. Overwhelmed by the weight of failure, she spiraled into isolation. A removed flashback showed her rewatching footage of the incident, convinced she could have done more, even though she followed protocol perfectly. Another abandoned subplot detailed her involvement in underground self-improvement circles groups that preyed on emotionally vulnerable professionals. Their rigid philosophies gave Larkin a sense of purpose, which she twisted into an extreme belief that society had to be refashioned into something orderly and clean, free of weakness and chaos. In an extended confrontation scene that never made it to film, Larkin admitted she no longer trusted traditional systems. She believed that only her harsh doctrine could prevent others from suffering the same pain she endured. Producers removed this layer of complexity, worried that audiences might connect too strongly with her emotional struggle. Without her erased past, Larkin appears as a single-note tyrant. But in the unreleased version, she was a wounded healer who transformed her grief into rigid fanaticism. Bonus fact: Cobra. In Cobra, the Night Slasher stands as one of the most frightening villains of 80 seconds action cinema, a sadistic cult figure driven by violent ideology and primal rage. But what audiences saw was only the surface. Beneath the theatrical cut was an entirely different character, one built on heartbreak, desperation, and manipulation. Early drafts portrayed the Night Slasher as a former factory worker whose life spiraled out of control during a devastating economic downturn. After losing his job and being unable to support his family, he watched his marriage collapse and eventually found himself living on the margins of society. In this broken state, he was approached by an extremist group that preyed on people like him, isolated, angry, and searching for meaning. One removed monologue had him confess that he once believed in justice, but felt abandoned by every institution he trusted. The speech described how he was slowly indoctrinated, taught to replace despair with rage, and to see violence as the only path toward empowerment. It was a haunting reveal that reframed him from a monster into a casualty of systemic collapse and psychological grooming. However, the studio felt this depth made him too sympathetic and shifted the film's tone away from its brutal, stylized identity. Stallone's vision leaned toward a relentless, iconic villain, not a tragic figure molded by circumstance. So every glimpse of the Night Slasher's past was cut, leaving behind an image of pure evil with no human roots. The theatrical Night Slasher is terrifying, but the version hidden in the drafts was something far more unsettling. A broken man weaponized by the very forces that failed him. You've just uncovered the hidden histories that were never meant to leave the cutting room. 15 villains whose erased backstories could have transformed their entire films. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Which of these lost origins shocked you the most? And which one do you think should have stayed in the final release? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading every single one of them. If you love digging into the secrets Hollywood hides behind its toughest villains, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're here for the next deep dive. More buried truths are coming.